started while we're still working out the technology and getting people online and assembling. We got a bunch of stuff to do today, so I have just a couple things to talk about, two really important ones. One is the schedule for submission of proposals and project descriptions for those folks who are going to be in the fiscal 17 package. We really need those proposals as soon as you can, not later than June 1st, because we've got to go through a review process and get those reviews back, potentially iterate with you on comments from reviewers, and get them into USGS funding portal by the end of the month. So the sooner we get those, and sort of we're coming on the June 1st deadline as a reasonably hard stop. Multiple of the proposals will also require, if it's a new proposal and not just another increment of funding on an existing award, you'll probably, well, you will have to complete a data management plan inside the RFP manager system so that we can actually submit the documents. Headquarters, NICWISC is getting hard-nosed about this, and we will not be able to submit funding documents for a project for which there is no data management plan. So that's a new hard stop on submissions that ends up being in your bucket as the PI or what have you.
Does that apply to extensions?
It doesn't apply to extensions. So if you've already got a project in and it's been funded and you're still in the period of performance and all that, you don't have to. But if it's a new project, and a goodly number of what we're doing, the FSA projects are all going to be new, so you'll have to go through that process. And it's relatively easy for simple projects, but you guys have probably done that more than I have. And when you've got real data collection and stuff, you've got to do some of that thinking up front.
So for Andy, Candida, me and Shannon, the FSAs, we'll have to sort of re-update that data plan, modify it slightly to meet the current proposed deliverables, but most of the data collection and data provisions probably should be in the existing data plan. So just revamping those a little bit, revising those for the new submissions that are coming up for FY17.
Okay, any comments on that or questions on that part of the process? Okay. The other one I just wanted to mention is I don't think we've sent it out, but Thursday morning, Jill, is Mountain Time for the Thursday morning town hall?
Yeah, that's going to be 7 a.m. Mountain Time.
So, yeah, at 7 a.m., and we take no responsibility for this, on Thursday, there's a stakeholder-oriented briefing on the USGS budget. My sense is that they're holding this briefing and making it public and webcasting it because they're worried about the numbers. There are two internal ones that are going to happen today and tomorrow. I just got the documents downloaded, and we suspected that the President's budget was going to propose substantial cuts, and I want to really focus on the word propose. This is the President's budget. This is not the congressional action. We've got a long way to go, but it's pretty ugly. The budget proposes to cut $9 million out of the $26 million Climate Science Center network, and to close 4 of the centers and combine them into what they call larger geographic regions. Not surprising. Other cuts in the budget take the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives program from $34 million to $5 million. Do things like completely eliminate the Pacific Salmon Recovery Program at $65 million. So there's a lot of really significant cuts proposed in here. They are proposed. We actually think that they won't be enacted. some of the folks on this phone and on this call have been part of congressional visits and other sorts of contacts which I guarantee have been effective and have been heard. So in spite of how painful this budget looks, I don't think it's going to be enacted in anything like what they're proposing. So you're going to hear a lot of noise and sturm and drang over the next couple of days from everything from Medicare all the way down to our little kinds of things. I think most of it is going to go in a very different direction. So we'll circulate after this meeting the connection information for that. I think you'll get a chance to hear some of the messaging. I think you may hear some of the senior folks weigh in on whether they think this will actually get enacted or not. But in any case, this stuff is starting to leak out. You'll hear a lot of noise, but I suspect that in the end, we'll still be here. We'll still be having these meetings every month without major disruptions. We'll probably hit some bumps, but that's it for now. Questions on that, or I'll turn it to Aparna and you all on the line to walk through our projects. And that's where we are.
So just a reminder that we asked you guys to give us just a brief overview of the project, a little bit of what end products you anticipate coming out of it. And then we've asked you guys to think about small-scale value adds. Within the next year or two, we don't think that we will be funding substantially large new science projects. But what we'd like to focus some of our energy and resources on is taking things that have come out of projects that we've already funded and closing the loop, so to speak, with the stakeholder community. So if you have ideas for that, just, please mention that as you go through. And since we do have a number of projects to get through and not a whole lot of time, we're asking you to keep your comments to 5 to 7 minutes. If you have slides that you'd like to use, let me know and I can pass presenter to you. But hopefully you could start talking as you're setting up the presenter mode as well. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so I started writing people down as they logged into the WebEx. We're going to do these in kind of a random order, I think. But Amy, you're the first one that I have down. So do you want to get started?
Yes, that's perfect, actually, because I have to get off the phone as soon as I can. So I do have slides if you want to pass control to me.
I can do that.
All right, and while you're doing that, so our project has a very long title, and it's Scaling Climate Change Adaptation in the Northern Great Plains through Regional Climate Summaries. Are you seeing my screen yet?
You need to accept the
yeah, I'm looking for that.
presenter privileges.
Privileges. Share my screen. There we go. Okay. So scaling climate change adaptation in the Northern Great Plains, so focusing on the Dakotas, basically, through regional climate summaries and local qualitative, quantitative scenario planning workshops. So we were trying to do a few things here. The major part was, the first major part was to conduct 2 scenario planning workshops with Park Service-centric focal areas to help Park Service units and their stakeholders incorporate climate change into their general planning. The first workshop was conducted at Knife River Indian Village's National Historic Site, which is just north of Bismarck, North Dakota, and dealt with a lot of cultural and archaeological issues and flooding along the Knife River and how that affects those resources. The second workshop was at Badlands Park in southwestern South Dakota, where we were focusing primarily on grazing and by both bison within the park and cattle in the surrounding national grasslands. Both of those scenario planning workshops incorporated much more quantitative climate scenarios in the descriptions of envisioning the future than has been done by the Park Service in their scenario planning workshops before. So that's part of the emphasis of this project. However, the workshops continued from those quantitative climate scenarios into qualitative assessments of basically expert opinion assessing how the resources of concern would respond in these different climates and what type of management actions would be appropriate in those conditions. We completed workshop reports that basically summarized all the information that was presented as well as exchanged and collected as part of the discussions. Those were provided to all the participants of the workshops in late summer of last year. And then after, or actually in the process of preparing for the Badlands qualitative workshop, we were also building a quantitative simulation model using software called ST-SIM. Brian Miller was doing most of this simulation work, working with Leonardo Frid. And the goal of these was to go that extra step from having the quantitative climate scenarios to having quantitative simulations to, instead of expert opinion, to assess the response of the ecosystem to the different climate scenarios and combine that with different management scenarios. So we simulated, I think it was something like 16 combinations of climate scenarios and management alternatives using this model that we built in a relatively quick turnaround period by lots of consultation with the managers we were working with and using as much published information as possible, but also relying on that expert opinion. We provided preliminary output from those simulations to the group, the Badlands group, in a second workshop in May of 2016, which yielded some aha moments for the managers in terms of maybe they could, maybe having more bison in the park, not being so conservative with their herd size would be good for the vegetation. Also some thoughts about whether the assumptions that the managers are using in terms of how much grazing is going to yield specific types of vegetation that they're managing for actually is, if those assumptions are held out when you put them in a quantitative model. We completed the final simulations after revising the model based on input from the managers during that May workshop, and we completed those last fall, and we just submitted a manuscript to Ecosphere, basically describing the model, getting the scientific review of this model that we hope to that will then help managers make decisions in terms of planning for their bison herd and water and grazing into the future. The project, as you might assume, based on what I've said so far, is winding down. We, in addition to the paper submitted to Ecosphere, which is pretty egg-headed modeling stuff, we are also finishing up a paper that's been almost accepted to climate risk management based on some earlier simulation work I did with Wind Cave, but bringing in a lot of the concepts from this Climate Science Center project that proposes a framework for integrating quantitative simulations into climate change scenario planning. We're hoping that we will take the work done at Badlands and describe how we applied that framework in a paper that will go in something like Park Science, where the managers are really seeing it, and then also summarizing the results into something that's very user-friendly for park managers. We are, and so getting to the question about the add-on, I think both Robin and Aparna are aware that we had something really cool lined up and then it fell apart. We are looking into some possible add-on to basically help the Park Service planning office incorporate scenario thinking into many of the planning projects that they do, especially resource stewardship strategies. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Amy. That was a very thorough and helpful recap for us. Does anyone have questions for me? Okay. Then I think we're going to move ahead. And Bray, can you give us an update on the Steve Hostetler project? And do you have slides that you would like to share?
Yes, I can just speak to you guys through here. The slides don't show anything too interesting, although I have some. But so this is a project that is already completed, and the title of the project is Informing Adaptation Strategies for Maintaining Landscape Connectivity for Northern Rockies Wildlife in Face of Climate Change. And then at the end, we decided to add challenges and limitations, because really what a lot of what came out of this work was the challenges that we faced trying to make management decisions at a small scale with these big, these large landscapes course climate scenarios. So the principal investigators on that were Meredith McClure, which is with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. She was also the project coordinator and the one that put the heavy weight on this project, and she's now with Conservation Science Partners. Steve Hostetler, U.S. Geological Survey, and myself, I'm a spatial ecologist with Heart of the Rockies Initiative. So in summary, we had two main objectives for this project, just so you guys get an idea. And the idea was to assess the climate change vulnerability of landscapes that are important for wildlife connectivity in the U.S. Northern Rockies. And we wanted to look at 8 main species, and those 8 main species were bighorn sheep, Canada lynx, fisher, greater sage-grouse, grizzly bear, mountain goat, mule deer, and wolverine. And then within that, we wanted, or the other objective was to develop decision-relevant adaptation strategies for climate-based management and conservation actions within the Great Northern region. So what we tried to do was look at the transition vegetation models in the region and try to combine them and see what we could learn from those, looking at how these species would, if the vegetation that these species are associated with changes, how would the connectivity for the species change and what that does mean for them. And we looked at three vegetation scenarios that have been developed and covered this region, and those are the Redfeld et al. 2012 climate, the vegetation scenarios, Schaefer et al. 2015, and Bachelet et al. 2016. So what we did was we assessed the adaptive capacity of the species in terms of their ability to continue to move across the landscape, given the projected changes in vegetation, incorporating current understanding of the species dispersal abilities. So we asked experts across the region to qualify and quantify that how much the species move and what would it mean if the vegetation would not be there for those species in the future. We also took into account the willingness of the species to move through landscapes modified by human land use and activity. And lastly, we included the Human Modification Index throughout the study area, which is the Dave Theobald's work that was published in 2013. So it's kind of basically what we tried to do. Then what we found was that the focal species, the 8 focal species, were subject to a range of potential impacts of climate-induced changes in vegetation, but these potential impacts were subject to high levels of uncertainty, and this is where we started looking at, what it is that we can really recommend to managers when we have our results with such high level of uncertainty. And a lot of that uncertainty came from disagreement on the vegetation models. But some commonalities that we found are that grizzly bear, mule deer, and wolverine are expected to experience the least severe impacts due to their high tolerance for a variety of vegetation types, particularly when migrating or dispersing. On the other hand, bighorn sheep, lynx, and mountain goats may be severely impacted by future vegetation transitions due to their narrow habitat preferences and projected climate change impacts on the habitats associated with those species. Kind of like in the middle ground, we have greater sedge grouse, and they're projected to experience moderate impacts with portions of their ranges potentially subject to widespread decline, but there are other areas that are projected to remain stable for them. At the biome level, we found that the alpine biome is by far projected to be the most vulnerable in the region, with projected loss of virtually all alpine areas in the region by 2060. And shrub and grassland biomes indicated mixed potential impacts, with some areas expected to remain largely intact and other broad areas expected to transition to forest cover. So what does this mean for management, which is what we really wanted to get at? Like, look at this with the best information that we have and try to provide managers with information useful to them. And what we found really was that most of these findings are subject to high levels of uncertainty stemming from multiple sources, and those sources were the variability among experts in potential impact and adaptive capacity of the species, the variability among modeling approaches in projected vegetation transitions, and the variability among projections generated under alternative combinations of global climate models and scenarios. So what that means, so as next steps to try to address some of these problems, we some of the big conclusions that came out of this work is that the kind of like the next steps that we're suggesting, which would be, well, perhaps using models of climate-induced vegetation change should use common inputs that together cover the range of uncertainty in climate models and across plausible scenarios, so that the differences among the climate predictions are attributable to the model formulations themselves. Also, models of climate-induced vegetation should be calibrated at smaller regional scales for better accuracy, so we have better understanding of the region effects of these. But so that's kind of like some of the major findings of the study. So where we are, the project has been completed, and we're waiting for the Bureau approval to have the link online and have this accessible to the public. We're very close to that. The end products are the report, which is finalized, and like I said, we're just waiting for approval, just waiting to put it up online with all of the metadata and the maps associated to those. The maps we have great northern vegetation types, but since we have 3 different models, we also have the modes of vegetation for the region. The agreement within the 3 models will also be available, and then the management recommendations that of which I mentioned some of them. And lastly, small-scale value add in the next year could probably be a webinar sharing an overview of the project and the recommendations, just expanding on the information I just gave you guys. I realized it was a lot, but that's where I am, and I think that's my time, and that's where we're with the project, and happy to answer any questions over here or over email.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bray. Any questions for Bray? Okay, I'm going to move along to the next update. Cody, do you have slides that you'd like to share?
No, I don't have any slides. I thought I'd just talk you through it.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, in our project, we've got a long title too. It's the Wind River Indian Reservation's Vulnerability to the Impacts of Drought and the Development of Decision Tools to Support Drought Preparedness. So really what that says is we're conducting drought vulnerability assessment for the reservation. And that includes the integration of climate, social perspectives, and ecological vulnerabilities. And as for how far we're into the project, that's one thing I need to double check with you. We were going to be ending in September, but I see on the new paperwork we just received for the year 3 funding, it shows an end date of March 31st of 2018. So we're ending sometime between September and next March, but I just need to double check that with you. We've got enough work to keep going, but I'll double check after the call and make sure we're all on the same page with the end date. So we're at least 2/3 of the way into the project right now. And this is a large collaborative project. You know, the main investigators are myself with the National Drought Mitigation Center. We're part of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We also have Shannon McNeely from the Climate Science Center, Mitch Contner, he's the Tribal Water Engineer for the Shoshone and Arapaho Tribes Office of the Tribal Water Engineer. We've got Jennifer Wellman with Wyoming EPSCoR, and then Mark Sabota, the Director of the National Drought Mitigation Center. But we've also got a large group of supporting partners from several state and federal agencies throughout Wyoming, Nebraska, and Montana. I'm not going to list them all. I think the last count there's about 15 of them. So we're really trying to capitalize on a lot of ongoing projects and target them to the Wind River Reservation. So I'd see the role of this project as really leveraging a lot of these activities and financial support, too, from at least one of those agencies to carry out the project objectives and to facilitate the collaboration and really help direct new research to achieve these objectives. Now, in terms of objectives for the project, we had 4 of them. And one is, of course, to conduct the drought vulnerability assessment. But we also had to use that information, you know, to integrate the results of the analysis and then work with the tribes to produce useful information. So we're planning on some journal articles, but also talking with our tribal partners, working with them to see what type of information they really need. We've done a lot of different types of data analysis, and we'd like to sit down with them and see, you know, do they need GIS maps? Do they need summary documents? Do they need storylines for communication? What exactly do we need? So that's another objective. And then we've got some educational aspects. One is to engage the community, the youth, other tribal natural resource managers, to provide education on general water resources, but also related to climate and drought risk management. And then to come up with, document our process and come up with some lessons learned to share with other tribes as well and other non-tribal partners to transfer some of the lessons learned from the project. So where we're at in completing these objectives is most of the vulnerability analysis has been completed. Like I mentioned, we've got the social analysis, the climate, and the ecological. In terms of the social analysis, Shannon McNeely's done a lot of interviews with tribal natural resource managers and the tribal elders to get their perspectives about historical drought occurrence, impacts, and then issues related to decision-making and drought management. We've also developed a drought history, and we're continuing to work on that. We've got a tool at the NDMC called the Drought Risk Atlas that has historical drought information, but some of the stations are kind of sparse on the reservation. So we're also coming up with some other historical stream flow data, for example, looking at snow-tell sites, and trying to piece together as much historical information we can from the observations. And then also looking at changing trends over time and projecting that into the future for some projections. And then for the ecological assessment, tapping into some ongoing work, looking at the effects of changing soil moisture on plant biomass, the effects on fisheries, and other ecological conditions. And so, you know, we're pulling together a lot of information about drought vulnerabilities on the reservation, and now is the time where we're really trying to integrate all of this work to tell a great story about the effects of drought and its management on the reservation, past, present, and future. And so as part of this, this is the time where we're sitting down with our tribal partners, trying to identify what type of, how would they want to package this information? How can we deliver it in the best formats? And we've already been working on a journal article, and we have a couple more planned. But I think the big push is going to be the tribe is, and kind of a parallel effort, has started to work on developing a drought plan. And a lot of this information from the drought vulnerability assessment will provide background for them to help make more informed management decisions about what they should do in the future. So we're hoping that a lot of this information will go into their drought plan as background information. And so we're working with them to try to do that right now. And so then on the educational aspects, we've already been involved in some educational activities with the youth through Wyoming EPSCOR and the Office of the Water Engineer's Office there. So as part of the project, we've held workshops with all of our partners and anyone who wants to come to the meetings to talk about drought and what we're doing and the past effects of drought and all of that. But then a lot of the youth education has been about basic water management principles, climate, and drought as well. So some of that's been going on, but I think now is the time in terms of completing it where we need to sit down and plan some of our final workshops or outreach engagements, and then develop some templates or some information packets that people can use after the project in terms of on the reservation, or maybe providing webinar modules or PowerPoint templates for training with other tribes or non-tribal natural resource managers off the reservation. So that's kind of where we're at. And in terms of possible add-ons, one thing that I've noticed is in our final budget, we don't have any money for travel unless we reallocate some money. And so it might be beneficial to us for the project over the next year to have some money for travel, to hold a workshop, to sit down and when they're developing their drought plan over the next year or so, to sit down and talk about what they need in terms of the outputs from our project and how that could fit into their plan as it's being developed over the next year. And possibly some type of a regional tribal training workshop on drought vulnerability assessment. We said we might hold some webinars at the end of the project, but maybe there's some opportunities for a more sit-down, in-person training workshop with some additional funds. So that's what I've got for now, and let me know if you have any questions.
Any questions for Cody? Okay, thank you so much for that presentation. Moving along, Susan, do you have slides that you'd like to share?
I do. I'm not sure that I'll be able to bring them up, but let's see how it goes.
Okay,
So our title is also quite long. We've been working on this project since we started in FY13, and we are looking at surrogate species for wetland-dependent birds in the prairie pothole region. We're looking at selection of these species, evaluation, and management in the face of climate change. And we have several offshoots of questions as well. We have been looking at wetland condition relative to climate, hydrology, and landscape. Now, is there a way that I'm supposed to share mine now? My screen?
Yeah, you need to, share and accept the presenter privileges.
Share and accept.
Oh, it says it's not called that exactly.
I see my screen. monitor 1.
Yep,
Can you see
there
it?
it goes. Yep.
You got it.
Okay, great. So surrogate species for wetland-dependent birds, and we are looking also at how wetland conditions that these birds are dependent on might change with climate, hydrology, landscape, doing species distribution models to look at how the birds might respond, and also looking at components of uncertainty in our work. A little bit of history on how we came up with this question. Historically, the wetland management in the area has been based on 5 species of dabbling ducks, and yet we know there are nearly 120 other species of birds that use these wetlands year-round. And so the managers there, the Prairie Potholes Joint Venture and the LCC, were really wondering whether these 5 species of ducks that they have lots and lots of information and insight on, if they effectively serve as surrogates for other species. And this concept of surrogate species as a way of sort of streamlining monitoring programs is very popular in a lot of the land management agencies in the interior now, Department of Interior. So I'm going to jump quickly now to outcomes. Through these past 4 or so years, collectively we have given over 30 presentations to cooperators. Not only did the Climate Science Center fund our work, but the Plains and Prairie Pothole LCC has done given us a lot of support through the years as well. We've been to several invitational meetings with the Climate Science Center, and they've always been really interesting. Collectively, we've presented our findings at several scientific society meetings. And we had planned to have our final workshops already conducted at this point, but we promise they will happen. Right, Rick? So, in terms of manuscripts, to date we've actually published 5 manuscripts that are in hard copy. Here's the first 4 of them. PLOS 1, Ecological Applications, and then 2 papers. The bottom one here on sediment accumulation is really more of a spin-off, but it's related. But the 2 final papers there were in a special issue of the journal Wetlands that's totally devoted to climate change in the Prairie Pothole. So it was really, it was based on a really exciting symposium. The other manuscripts we have, Helen Sofair took the lead on another one, whether you call it a spin-off or not. It was directly related to the project, and that one is already online early in global change biology. Valerie Steen finished her doctorate in December, and her next 2 papers, she had 2 from earlier, and her next 2 papers have both been submitted. We also worked with Ben Rashford, who's an economics professor in Wyoming, who has done some work that was also incorporated in another earlier manuscript. And we have 2 that are in preparation or very near completion that really summarize a lot of the surrogate aspects of things. And I'm just going to take a couple minutes, if you don't mind, to give some highlights on some of the findings of the papers yet to come out. And this is one of my favorite figures from Valerie Steen's dissertation, showing the amount of uncertainty that there is. She ran for each of almost 30 species using breeding bird survey data, over 1,000 models incorporating different decision tools and different decisions in formulating her model. So she used 10 different climate scenarios. She used several different examples of covariates that would go in these models and some other things. And so there is a lot of uncertainty in how much range would be lost for these species. But the things to point out here is that pretty much there's a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of them do seem to be losing range. The other thing is to notice that the ones in highlighted in orange there are the 5 waterfowl species, and even they are quite variable in how much range loss we're expecting from them. The surrogate species approach was really intense. Helen Sofair took the lead on that, and we looked at several different ways of clustering species and then did an ensemble of all these clusters and came out with this figure that shows that the 5 species of waterfowl are really very close in what you'd expect. And we're looking at some of these other groups and how does it compare. But just one thing we did that was really interesting is we looked at, with Valerie's species distribution models that show a long time period, 30 years, of normal and wet years and drought years in the contemporary time period, and then an ensemble of the future years from these many different climate models. If you look over a long time period and a very large spatial extent, and this is just kind of gestalt here, you see that, oh, I'm sorry, I used the wrong figure here. I had meant to show one that had on the top row the 5 dabbling ducks and on the bottom row all the non-ducks. And it actually shows very similar to this in that it's really the wetland basins that determine where the wetlands are going to be in the future. And so you see some of the same patterns, like some of the same hot spots in the normal in the future, the normal years in the future, and pretend this bottom line is all the non-ducks. Sorry, I put the wrong figure in there. And you see some of the same parts of the landscape pop out. And we want to do some further work to kind of quantify this. But through the, we have the surrogate models run at different time scales on a yearly basis, spatial scales. And so at a smaller time scale and smaller spatial scale, in a given year at a refuge, you might want to focus on those birds that are more likely to decline in their range. But overall, over a 30-year period, where these wetlands exist on the landscape is probably still going to work. One minor detail, we also worked on migrating shorebirds and showed that in 2 years where we have data, in a dry year and a wet year, their distributions are very different. And we believe that migrating shorebirds, they require shallow water habitats unobstructed by vegetation, but they can move about the landscape from year to year to find those. So I won't go through all of our key findings here. If there was a bit more money available this year, we could certainly use some more travel funds so that we can transfer our information to our partners. And I am still working on this final management-oriented synthesis and could always use some help with that if there's a small amount of money. So that's what I have.
Hi, Susan. Thank you. This is Robin. I just had one quick question, and that was on the, who would those partners and managers be? Who is it that, and what actions are they considering? Can you just say a little bit about that?
Well, we have 2 groups of managers we're focusing on. The managers that are in the Northern Great Plains, Rick Nelson, I believe, is on the call with the LCC and the Playa Lakes Joint Venture. And I think they just want to incorporate it into their larger scale plans. They're very active in this. The other group of managers would be here in Fort Collins, the national level monitoring group with Mark Chase and a number of his colleagues that, in fact, we'll be working with them quite closely, probably as they deal with some of the real estate decisions they make, and yeah, we'll be transferring a lot of our models to them.
Great, great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Susan, this is Brad Beltran. I recently saw a presentation by Patrick Donnelly with the Intermountain West Joint Venture, and he's looking at, he's doing something that, if I understand it correctly, is it's different, but what he's trying to get at is kind of like the similar outcomes of what you are trying to do. And I just think that perhaps it'll be worth you checking with Patrick because both works are really, really interesting. So if you, I just wanted to let you know that somebody is doing something similar looking at the dryness and the wetness of these wetlands here in the Intermountain West, and perhaps there might be some things of interest for you there, and vice versa.
That's very good information. I've written his name down, and yes, the Intermountain West has so many parallel issues dealing with the climate variability in the landscape. So thank you for that.
No problem.
Thank you, Susan. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next person, Hong Li. I know you have slides that you sent me. Do you want me to show the slides, or do you want me to pass presenter to you?
I think, can you hear me, or?
Yes.
Okay. I think I'm going to use my slides because then I can control the flow.
Okay, there's two of you in the room right now. Could you just let me know which one is the one I should pass the presenter to?
Okay, there are actually three of us. David is also in the room. He's not
I mean in the WebEx room, if you look at the participant list, there's two Hong Lees in there.
Okay, let me see. I think I have to use the dial-in, is it? I don't know. Okay, I don't really know how technology works, so I tried the web and then I tried the phone. Should I use the web or should I use the phone?
Why don't you pass this to the first one?
Okay.
Yeah, I think they'll both work because I did the same thing where I was on twice, and so they probably will both work.
Okay, I'm gonna do the top one, okay, and then see. You're not the presenter?
Did you get an alert saying that you're the presenter?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So you should be able to show your slides now.
I still have your personal room upon our personal room.
Yeah, so you accept your role as a presenter and say you share the screen.
Where do I go for share the screen?
Go up to share in the upper left.
Okay. My screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
You see it now?
Yay, you did it.
Yeah. I did it. Okay.
Hey.
Oral exam coming up.
Yeah, we see your email now.
Good luck with your orals.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So I'm gonna start with the first couple of slides. So our project title is Understand Dynamics of Land Use Using Satellite and Field Level Data.
Hong Li, sorry, just a minute. We can only see your email up right now. We don't actually see your PowerPoint.
Monitor.
You might need to.
You might have to select the other monitor on the, go back to share and then my screen and then do the other monitor. There you go.
Yeah. There we go, we got it.
Okay, so so our project, like others, has a long title, but the short version is just land use change with satellite and field level data in the context of climate change. So there are a few investigators. The original investigator is David Hennessy, who is here, and since he moved, the project remains at Iowa State. So the co-PI, original co-PI Peter Water, now is the PI. I'm Hong Li Feng, so it's presenting today here. And the next couple of slides are the background information. A few of you know, some of you probably don't remember. So our project is about. So you look at the next slide. Let me see, okay, here we go. I think all of you know the vulnerability of the study region of the prairie pothole region. So that's our focus study area. It's the Dakotas. Specifically, we focus on grassland loss, the conversion between grassland and cropland. So we try to work with landowners and the conservation managers to see, how to target land for protection and how to incentivize landowners for protection. We have 4 objectives. So we need to gather the data. That's the first one. We analyze the vulnerability, and we propose try to design analytical tools to analyze the problem and to address the problem. Finally, we identify lands to target for grassland protection. So in the proposal, this is a picture from the proposal, so it's a circular process. That's what we have done so far. We traveled to the study region back when the project started in 2005. David Hennessy and Chris Anderson traveled to the region. They talked to land managers from different organizations, government agencies, and non-government organizations. We listened. We learned about their priorities and their concerns. And after that, we came back and we did some analysis. And then in 2006, last March, 2016 March, we went back again to conduct farmers meetings. We gathered 80 farmers in 4 locations of the Dakotas. We had questionnaires for them to finish, and we talked to them. We learned about how they make decisions, how their decisions are affected by weather, and after that, we did further analysis, and we plan to go back towards the end of the project again. So it is a circular process that we have been doing. So for the next slide, it's from our data gathering process. That's just one picture of our output. It's the black area shows how much land is the land that's being converted from other uses to corn and soybeans. That shows the extent of loss, mostly your loss of grassland. For that, we have a manuscript in preparation. That's by Peter Water and our graduate student, Gaurav. Gaurav was a graduate student. He has since taken a faculty position back in India. And so I think all of us here probably know that the regions, Dakotas and even the Great Northern Plains is a hotspot of grassland loss, especially through the expansion of corn and soybean acreage. Some of our output, so we have gathered data through our focus group meetings back in the Dakotas. Dodge is a current graduate student of ours. And there we want to know how farmers respond to economic incentives. So basically, landowners have land and they expect a return from their investment in land. They earn profits from grassland use or from more intensive crop production. Then our question is, do they respond to higher profits? Whichever one offers higher profits, is that higher profits land use will be the one that they turn to. So it turns out our initial result seems to suggest while some of them do respond that way, it's economic incentive, but what do you say? But actually, most of them do not seem to respond to economic change that way. For example, so while it's very worrisome, and many people are concerned that so much grassland has been lost. But if you look at the conversion costs, and if you look at the difference between crop returns and the grassland returns, actually the question to ask is, why haven't more landowners converted? So that's one of the research questions that we are trying to address through the data that we gathered at our focus group meetings in the study region. This is a part of the output in the context of understanding change. So we all know that we need to understand change first, and then we study how we can manage the change. So that's the next slide. I mentioned the talk with the land managers, both in the government and the non-government agencies. And we have a couple of manuscripts under preparation. And I think all of them have been presented at professional meetings. So basically, we try to analyze how grassland, how best to protect the grassland. Through our discussions with landowners, with land managers, conservation managers, it seems that easement is a very important tool in the region that has been explicitly stated by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. So some of our research focuses on how grassland easements can be most effectively implemented. That requires an understanding of benefits and the costs. by cost and benefits, it's not just we tell you what's on the ground. We really try to understand the temporal and spatial changes. Like when a farmer converts grassland to cropland, he understands, and the conservation managers need to understand that he gives up the opportunity of not converting in the future. What if the market situation changes? Cropland is not going to be so profitable. And also for benefits, we really consider the additionality of benefits. If a farmer is going to leave land in grass anyway, then that grassland, the benefit provided by that grassland is not benefit added by conservation easements. So these are some of the issues that we try to tease out to better understand how easement funding can be better targeted. Another output, which we are at the very end of the submission, hopefully, can submit today or tomorrow, is about how climate change will affect regional land use changes. So the contribution here is that so far as we know in the literature, mostly, the focus is on one crop or just on land use change. So in our research, we try to put the impact of weather and the climate change on all of the major crops. So for our study region, it would mean corn, soybean, wheat, and grass, like alfalfa. So we study the land use change impact on all of these crops, and then we go one step further to say how the climate change impacts will be reflected in land use change. Afterward, that's where, the linkage with some of the wildlife habitat protection issues. For that, what we have found is under future climate change scenarios, all crops will experience lower yields because of a drier weather condition and higher temperature. The most affected will be the spring wheat. That's going to be most affected, wheat and alfalfa. Based on our prediction, it will experience the largest yield reduction. The yield changes will impact land use changes, and so this slide shows the change of different crops. So basically, our results indicate that corn and soybean acreage will decline, especially in South Dakota, and we'll see more grass acreage and more wheat acreage. And the acreage for alfalfa basically is going to be quite, you may say, similar to what we are observing now. In terms of what's coming up, we have a few manuscripts that are in working paper format and that has been accepted for presentations at our professional annual meetings. And as I mentioned earlier, we do plan to travel back to the study region in the fall of this year, and we have academic collaborations with South Dakota State University, and we also plan to revisit with some of the land managers over there to talk about the research progress and to say how we have our research can help them. That's about it. You have anything to add, David?
Thanks, Hong Lee. I appreciate the overview of the project. We do have 2 more projects to go through real quick. So I understand if people have to hop off the phone. We'll just try to get through those 2 pretty quickly, and then we can let people go. So Arjun, are you able to give an update on Andy's White Bark Pine project, and do you need presenter privileges?
This is Katie Ireland, and I have worked with Andy on the White Bark Pine project, so he asked me to give a brief update on that, and then I'll pass it on to Arjun for his work. So I don't have slides. I'll just talk. I'm only involved in a small piece of this project, so I'll do my best to give you an update. But the White Bark Pine project title, like everybody else's, was long. It's Informing Implementation of the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee's White Bark Pine Strategy based on climate sciences, ecological forecasting, and valuation of whitebark pine-related ecosystem services. The lead PIs on this were Andy Hansen and Kathy Whitlock, and then I have been working a little bit on spatial mapping of climate adaptation strategies and evaluation of those strategies. But this project was originally motivated by the decline of whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem due to beetles, fire, competition, et cetera, and the fact that a group of federal managers and biologists, the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee, had in 1999 started working towards a strategy to protect and restore whitebark pine in the area, but at the time they were developing this strategy, there wasn't a lot of climate science information that was useful for them to develop the strategy and incorporate into their restoration planning. So this project, the overall goal was to do some climate science and then to try to help inform implementation of this federal agency group's whitebark pine strategy based on the climate science and the ecological forecasting. There were about 5 objectives in the original study. These were to forecast ecosystem processes and whitebark pine habitat suitability based on future climate scenarios, and then to improve the understanding of possible responses to future by looking at whitebark pine climate relationships in past millennia. 3rd, to develop some whitebark pine management alternatives. 4th, to evaluate those alternatives under future climate scenarios. And 5th, to draw recommendations for implementation of the strategy that consider uncertainty. And where we're at now, as far as the ecological forecasting objective goes, PhD student in Andy's lab, Tony Chang, did an ecological forecasting using species distribution models for whitebark pine and found that only about 4 to 29% of its current habitat will remain suitable by the end of the century, depending on the climate scenario you use. And that paper has been published in PLOS One. And then Andy was the primary author on a paper looking at the climate vulnerability of 11 different conifer species, finding that whitebark pine was the most vulnerable of those. And then Brian Miller also published a paper on state and transition models that incorporated climate science for whitebark pine. So that's the ecological forecasting objective. And then one paper has been published that I'm aware of on the paleo perspective on climate whitebark pine relationships, and that found that surprising resilience of the species in the past. So whitebark pine and limber pine, because they can't be differentiated by pollen, were particularly abundant during past periods of warmer summer climates when there was higher fire activity associated, giving a longer-term perspective and suggesting that the species could have a broader range of responses to climate change than we would have expected. Our 3rd objective was to develop management scenarios, and a few different papers have been published along these lines. One was a review paper in Forests where we talked about what the current threats are to whitebark pine, what possible management activities might be, and how we might need to think about incorporating climate change into that management. In addition, Andy worked with Liz Shanahan and Helen Naughton from MSU and the University of Montana to do some surveys of support for whitebark pine management in the Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming region. And as far as I'm aware, one of those papers has been published and 3 are in preparation. And what they primarily found was they conducted this study and found a high level of concern for whitebark pine, a high level of support for restoration, and a pretty high willingness to pay for treatments, on average $135 per family, which represents a total sum of about $163 million. for support for whitebark pine restoration activities. And then my piece of this has been to work on developing some spatial climate adaptation strategies for whitebark pine. And to do that, we've worked closely with the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee in the region, and using the species distribution models developed in the ecological forecasting portion of this project that were developed by Tony Chang, we overlaid suitable habitat now and suitable habitat in the future to develop zones of habitat suitability for whitebark pine representing core, deteriorating, and future habitat. Then we also overlaid those with species distribution models for other competing conifer species and took those results and maps to the managers, asked them what types of management actions they might want to have available to them in the different zones, and then we mapped that out and compared how that corresponds to current management strategies. And that is a paper that's in preparation right now, just detailing how this might be done and comparing current and what we're calling climate-informed management. We expect to submit that manuscript in the next couple of weeks. And then the next step, Andy and I were able to get a little bit of additional funding through the Great Northern LCC to do mechanistic simulation modeling to actually evaluate those two different management strategies, the current strategy and then these climate-informed strategies. And we have finished those simulations and are working through the results, trying to understand them. The initial results are interesting and almost correspond with the results from the paleo work, where we are actually finding under one of our warmest, hottest climate scenarios, there's quite a bit of increased fire activity, and whitebark pine's actually expanding into lower elevation habitats. But we're still working through those results and understanding them. Hopefully we will be submitting that manuscript in the next month. And where we are from here is really the project is pretty much wrapped up. We've submitted the final report, and I'll let Arjun talk about any upcoming work that this might fit into.
What we are going to do is we are working on the proposal for FY17, and we have proposed to disseminate this information with various stakeholders related to NGO, INGO, federal government, and local government. If it is funded, we will organize series of workshops and meetings, along with inviting the people from various stakeholders, and we will disseminate or propose the management scenario that Katie is currently developing. That's all for the future plan.
Thank you so much, Katie and Arjun. Appreciate the update. And lastly, Ben Poulter, do you need to share slides?
Yeah, that would be great, please.
Okay. I will pass presenter to you then. Thank you for hanging in there, even though we're running over.
Yeah, okay. Let's see. Okay, so I am the presenter. And
in the upper left, you should have a share button, and then you should be able to share either your screen or an application, and you can pick PowerPoint.
Okay, so you can see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, thanks. Yeah, I'll try and keep it fairly quick. So our project began in the fall of 2015, and the goal was to look at the sensitivity of sagebrush ecosystems to climate change. And the project was led by myself out of Montana State University, and involved postdoc Katie Renwick, a few PhD students from different universities, Utah State, University of Connecticut, and Colorado State, and involved co-PIs Cam Aldridge and Peter Adler and Bethany Bradley. The goal was to use was to see how we could better communicate the results from ecosystem models applied to looking at the climate sensitivity of big sagebrush. And we took a multi-model approach to do this using a couple of different statistical approaches and a couple of different process-based ecosystem modeling approaches. And the schematic here kind of illustrates one of the early ideas that we put in the proposal to kind of convey the climate sensitivity of the species without kind of drilling down to the per pixel level, which we felt might give a false sense of security. So we're still kind of working on this kind of conceptual approach in terms of how to convey the results. The 4 modeling approaches included spatial correlations. So this is just looking at the relationship of plant cover to different climate variables. Temporal correlations, where we had long-term data sets on changes in sagebrush cover with different climate variables. And these 2 ecosystem process-based modeling approaches, the one developed by Daniel Schlepfer, which is a seedling survival model that really takes into account the hydrologic conditions and things like soil moisture. And then another mechanistic model known as LPJ-GUESS, which takes into account climate and the feedbacks on hydrology, but also the effects of atmospheric CO2 on photosynthesis and water use. So we had kind of we kind of scoured different data sets to come up with observations of sagebrush and percent cover and relationships between growth and climate, and use those observations to parameterize the 4 models. And so on the left here, you can see kind of the full data set in gray, and then the blue points indicate the locations that we use to fit the models with. And the modeling kind of went through 2 different phases of analysis. One was to look at the sensitivity of the model predictions, the step changes in precipitation and temperature. And this was done to get an idea of really what was kind of limiting the growth response of big sagebrush to climate. And then we looked at some climate forecasts from the IPCC. And so this figure shows the 4 different modeling approaches in each kind of sub-panel. And we concluded from this that really it's temperature that is kind of the common climate limitation on sagebrush growth and distribution. And so with the spatial correlation approach, the climate limitations include kind of some degree are equal between precipitation and temperature, but then for the other 3 modeling approaches, they're really kind of biased towards this temperature limitation. And so using kind of this idea that temperature is limiting the distribution of sagebrush, we could then try to summarize the IPCC climate projections to see what we can expect in terms of changes in sagebrush cover and regeneration over the next 100 years. And so what these figures are showing, again, are the 4 different modeling approaches and the response of cover and regeneration on the y-axis relative to the the present day mean annual temperature. And for all 4 models, the majority of the sites showed a positive response to temperature change, which was particularly obvious at the cooler end of the range, with some negative effects in the warmer edge of the range. And so if we look at this spatially, then we can kind of see that in blue we're seeing high agreement across in kind of the dark blue colors. We're seeing agreement with all 4 of the models in showing a positive response to climate change. The purple shows 3 of the 4 models agree with a positive response, and the red is showing a negative response in the range. And then we can kind of see this this relationship between the mean annual growing temperature with the response mostly being a positive response to temperature change in the next 100 years. And so the multi-model approach generally yields these kind of consistent predictions in terms of cooler sites showing more of a benefit from warming. Precipitation seasonality interacted somewhat with the warming effect, and where we showed the more variable precipitation, it was more likely to have a negative effect with warming. And there were sites that we had kind of no agreement with the models, but this was kind of in the minority of sites. And there was still some work to be done to really understand what the precipitation response meant. So what this means for management is that we had a managers workshop in Fort Collins in the fall to try to summarize some of this information that would be useful for managers. And we've been working on a way to kind of visualize the results using interactive web tools to do this. We have a paper that's in review right now, and we're working on a USGS style fact sheet. The kind of the main message from the work is that we do have some confidence from using different modeling approaches that the cooler range of big sagebrush won't necessarily have a negative response to temperature change. And so we're trying to put this in the context of some of the management opportunities that could be implemented for big sagebrush restoration in the context of climate change. What we'd like to do in the future would be to use the mechanistic model to now look at interactions between invasive species, and species like cheatgrass, how that modifies the fire regime, and how that would be modified by climate change, and then feed back onto affecting the distribution of sagebrush. And so the study so far just takes into account climate changes, but we'd like to kind of look at the full suite of effects and pressures that are taking place in the system.
Thanks so much, Ben. And thank you, everyone, for hanging in there until the very end. If you have any questions or comments or concerns about the budget process going forward, please get in touch with Robin and myself, and hopefully we'll be having these discussions every month going forward. So we'll talk to you next month.